As I placed the last cup on the kitchen table, a quiet dread settled over me. It wasn't fear exactly, but a strange pressing weight, like the silent tension just before. I could feel it in my stomach, nodding and twisting as I read my sister's letter again. She hadn't called, hadn't even mentioned anything unusual. And yet here was this message, brief and to the point. Her son would be spending the summer with me, alone, at my remote lake house. She'd said he needed a change of scenery, a reset, she called it. But the tone of her words felt off, like something hidden beneath, leaving me questioning everything I knew about her and her son. My lake house had always been a refuge, a retreat from the chaos of life, tucked away in a quiet, surrounded by trees and open water. The thought of sharing it, even with family, stirred something I couldn't quite put my finger on. And then, before I could make sense of the feeling, I heard the hum of an engine approaching, tires crunching over gravel. My breath caught in my throat. He wasn't supposed to arrive until tomorrow. I barely had time to process that he was here already, let alone get used to the idea. I stepped out onto the porch, a nervous smile fixed on my face as I watched his car pull up to the drive. It wasn't a familiar sight. This was no child, but a nearly grown young man, tall, lean, with a serious face set in concentration as he parked. Gone were the round cheeks and wide-eyed innocence I remembered. Now he had an air of self-assuredness, a kind of quiet defiance that stopped me in my tracks. There was something unreadable in his gaze as he finally looked up and met my eyes. A flicker of recognition mixed with something else I couldn't quite name. He stepped out of the car, and I struggled to find my voice. "You're early," I said, managing a smile as I walked toward him. I wanted to make this seem like an ordinary family reunion, but the words came out stilted, more formal than I'd intended. His expression didn't shift as he nodded, giving a small, almost polite smile in return. "Yeah," he replied, looking around, taking in the surroundings with an unreadable expression. "Thought I'd surprise you." We stood there, an odd silence between us, punctuated only by the occasional chirping of birds in the distance. The air was thick with questions I couldn't quite bring myself to ask. Instead, I motioned him toward the house, feeling like I'd entered a new chapter of my life without any sense of how the pages would turn. As we walked inside, I felt my usual sense of familiarity with the space slipping away, as if the presence of this young man, someone who was family, yet somehow a stranger, transformed the place I once called my own. He wandered through the room slowly, his eyes scanning everything with a curiosity that seemed almost clinical, as if he were cataloging the details. I watched him from the doorway, feeling a growing tension I couldn't name. This was someone I knew yet didn't know, and his quiet scrutiny of my world felt invasive and settling. "Make yourself at home," I finally said, breaking the silence, the words sounding oddly formal, even to my own ears. "Thanks," he replied simply, still glancing around, before his gaze settled on me once more. There was something intense in his eyes, an awareness far beyond his years. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was simply the effect of time and growing up. After all, he was nearly an adult now. But even as I tried to reason away the strange weight in the air, it lingered, a reminder that this summer wouldn't be like any other. I led him to the guest room, pointing out where he could find towels, showing him the little details of the place. As he set his bag down, I turned to leave, but a single word stopped me, and I turned back, feeling a flicker of relief at the familiar address. "Yes?" He hesitated, his face softening for just a moment before returning to that same unreadable calm. "Thanks for letting me stay here." Something about the way he said it, a quiet intensity in his voice, made me pause. It was a simple enough sentiment, but there was an edge to it, as though the words carried a hidden meaning I couldn't quite grasp. "Of course," I replied, a little too quickly, eager to ease whatever tension was hovering between us. "It'll be nice to have company for a change." He nodded, a small, polite smile crossing his lips again, but it didn't reach his eyes. I could feel him watching me as I turned to leave, the air charged with a sense of something unspoken, something that lay just beneath the surface. Back in the kitchen, I busied myself with making coffee, trying to shake off the strange, lingering feeling that had settled over me since he'd arrived. The whir of the machine filled the silence, grounding me in its familiar hum. But no amount of mundane routine could quiet the questions buzzing at the back of my mind. Why had he come so suddenly? Why the guarded looks, the distant gaze? My sister's letter replayed in my thoughts, its tone somehow sharper, more urgent now that he was here in the flesh. As the coffee brewed, I glanced out the window and saw him standing on the back porch, hands in his pockets, gazing out over the lake. He looked so alone, framed by the stillness of the water and the quiet of the woods. And in that moment, I felt a wave of unexpected emotion. A strange combination of protectiveness and unease, like watching someone caught between two worlds. A young man still tethered to boyhood, yet reaching for something just out of reach. I wanted to go to him, to say something that would break the silence and bridge the distance. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood there watching him from the kitchen window, feeling as if I were on the edge of something, a precipice I couldn't see but could sense all the same. And as the last rays of the setting sun cast long shadows across the yard, I realized that whatever this summer held, it would be unlike any before. When he finally came back inside, our eyes met, and I felt a jolt of something strange and unplaceable. A feeling that lingered long after he disappeared into his room for the night. I couldn't shake the sense that this summer would change everything. But somehow, in ways I couldn't yet understand, I'd find myself altered by it all. But what that meant and how it would play out remained hidden in the shadowed corners of the house, waiting to unfold. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, casting a warm glow over the table where I sat with my coffee. I had barely slept, kept awake by the quiet presence of someone else in the house. The usual morning sounds, the birds, the soft rustling of the trees, felt amplified in the silence. A stark contrast to the restless thoughts in my head. It was odd having him here. I kept telling myself to relax, that this was just family spending time together. But that odd tension from yesterday lingered, an undercurrent I couldn't ignore. I heard him stir, his footsteps soft on the stairs. When he finally appeared in the doorway, he looked different somehow, maybe more relaxed, but still with that same guarded expression. He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth as he poured himself some coffee, and joined me at the table. So he began glancing around before his eyes settled on me. Quiet place. Yes, I replied, nodding. Peaceful. Thought it might be good for you, actually. Away from the noise of everything. I was trying to sound casual, but even as I spoke, I felt his eyes on me, studying me, as if searching for something in my words. He didn't respond, only sipped his coffee, his gaze moving from me to the window. I felt like I should fill the silence, but nothing I could think of seemed appropriate. The air between us grew heavy, and I found myself shifting uncomfortably under his gaze. After breakfast, he wandered off to explore, and I returned to my own routine, trying to lose myself in the familiar tasks of the day. But as the hours stretched on, I couldn't ignore the fact that something had shifted between us. Every time he passed by, I felt his presence like a weight, pressing into the quiet spaces of the house. Later, we found ourselves outside, walking along the edge of the lake. The afternoon sun glistened on the water, casting dancing reflections that flickered across our faces. He was silent, lost in his thoughts, and I felt a strange impulse to reach out, to connect with him in some way. But the words wouldn't come. You know, he said suddenly, breaking the silence. I don't remember this place much, just bits and pieces. I nodded, glancing at him. That's understandable. You were so young the last time you were here. He stopped, turning to look at me with a strange intensity in his gaze. It's like I remember you more than the place. His words took me off guard, and I didn't know how to respond. He held my gaze, a flicker of something indefinable in his expression. I felt a warmth rise to my cheeks, an unexpected reaction that left me flustered. There was something in his tone, a maturity that seemed out of place. Before I could respond, he turned away, his eyes drifting back to the lake, and the moment slipped away as quickly as it had arrived. But that small exchange lingered in my mind, echoing in ways I couldn't quite understand. As the day slipped by, we fell into an easy rhythm, the quietness of the house slowly filling with the sounds of everyday life. Each morning he'd join me for coffee, and we'd sit in companionable silence, watching the sun climb higher over the trees. There was something comforting about the routine. Yet still, I couldn't shake the tension that lingered in the background, subtle and unspoken. One late afternoon, he appeared in the kitchen with an unexpected spark in his eyes, something bright that seemed to break through his usual reserve. And he said, leaning against the counter, "Can we go out to the garden?" I looked up, surprised. The garden? Sure, but what brought that on? He shrugged, his gaze drifting toward the window. I was just thinking about the melons. You remember? We planted them together last year. I felt my heart skip a beat, caught off guard by his memory. I'd almost forgotten about that day. We'd worked side by side, digging the earth and pressing the seeds into the soil. He was younger then, still a boy with an infectious enthusiasm that made me laugh. I hadn't expected him to remember. It felt like something from another time, another place. You remembered? I asked, my voice soft with surprise. He looked at me, a small smile playing on his lips. Of course I wanted to see if they grew. All right, I replied, still taken aback. Let's go have a look. We walked out into the late afternoon light, crossing the yard toward the small patch of garden tucked away behind a line of trees. The air was warm and heavy, the late summer heat clinging to everything, and I could smell the faint, earthy aroma of the garden as we drew closer. When we reached the rows of plants, he knelt down by the vines, his fingers brushing gently over the leaves. I watched him, captivated by his concentration, by the way he seemed to lose himself in the simple task. He looked up, his expression suddenly lighting up as he spotted a few of the melons, round and green, hidden beneath the foliage. There they are, he said softly, almost to himself. I knelt beside him, reaching out to touch one of the fruits, feeling its firm, smooth surface under my hand. They've grown so well, I didn't expect them to take, honestly. I thought you'd forgotten all about it. He shook his head, glancing at me with a hint of that same intensity that always left me unsettled. No, he replied quietly, I didn't forget. I remember everything about that day. It was nice. For a moment we sat there in silence, side by side, surrounded by the quiet life of the garden. There was a calmness in the air, a gentle warmth that seemed to settle over us like a soft blanket, but beneath it I could feel the same tension simmering, an awareness that pulsed between us in a way I couldn't ignore. We stood up, brushing dirt off our hands, and began making our way back toward the house. The shadows had grown longer, stretching across the yard as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting everything in a soft golden light. He walked beside me, and I felt his gaze on me, steady and unwavering, as though he were seeing me in a way I hadn't expected. As we neared the back porch, he stopped, looking down at me with that same intensity that had unsettled me in the kitchen a few mornings before. And he said quietly, his voice soft, almost hesitant. I turned to face him, searching his face for some hint of what he was about to say. But instead of words, he leaned forward, closing the space between us in a single, brief moment. It was a fleeting gesture, unexpected and quick, leaving me stunned and rooted to the spot. He pulled back just as quickly, his expression unreadable as he looked at me. I opened my mouth to speak, to say something, anything, that would break the silence that had fallen over us, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, we stood there, the weight of what had just happened settling between us like a secret that neither of us knew how to handle. The air felt thick, almost oppressive, and I struggled to find something to say that would ease the tension. But he simply stepped back, offering a small, almost shy smile before turning and heading toward the house. I watched him go, feeling a strange mix of confusion and curiosity, a brief moment replaying in my mind like a scene from a dream. By the time I gathered myself enough to follow him, he had already disappeared inside. I stood there for a moment, letting the cool evening air wash over me, trying to shake the strange, lingering feeling that clung to me. It was as though something had shifted between us, something subtle and unspoken that had crept up on us when we weren't looking. As I finally turned to head back into the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that this summer was changing things in ways I hadn't anticipated, drawing us into a new understanding of each other that felt both familiar and entirely new. The next morning dawned quietly, sunlight filtering through the curtains as I sat alone, in the living room, a book open on my lap. The air in the house felt different, thicker somehow, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the tension that had been building between us. My mind kept drifting back to the moment in the garden, the fleeting touch, the look in his eyes that I hadn't been able to read. I couldn't shake it off, couldn't make sense of it, and the uncertainty left me on edge. I heard his footsteps as he came down the stairs, each step measured and slow, and I felt a pang of anticipation I couldn't ignore. He entered the room, his expression casual as he glanced at me, offering a small, almost tentative smile, but his eyes, they held something that made me feel like he was searching, looking for something that only I could provide. I closed the book and set it aside, trying to find a way to break the silence. But he beat me to it. I saw that old diary on the shelf upstairs, he said, nodding in the direction of the Is it yours? I was taken aback, surprised he'd even noticed. Yes, I replied, feeling a strange blend of nostalgia and vulnerability. It's from my teenage years. I haven't read it in ages. He hesitated, as if weighing his next words carefully. Would you read something from it? If that's okay. The request felt strangely intimate, like he was asking to see a part of me I'd long since tucked away. But there was something in his voice, a curiosity that was almost earnest. I nodded, motioning for him to follow me as I led him up the stairs to the small study, where I kept my old journals, their pages filled with my younger self's thoughts, hopes, and dreams. We sat on the floor by the window, the diary resting between us. I opened it carefully, my fingers brushing over the faded ink, and began reading aloud, my voice soft as I let myself slip back into memories I hadn't revisited in years. The words came alive again, a glimpse into the past, and I felt myself pulled back to that time, to the thoughts and emotions of a girl who once believed in simple dreams. As I read, I noticed him watching me, his gaze focused and intense, as though he were trying to decipher something hidden within the lines. It was strange, reading these words with him, sharing parts of myself I'd almost forgotten. When I reached a passage about a summer crush, I hesitated, glancing up to see his reaction. But he just listened, his expression calmed, as if absorbing each word. When I finished, the room fell into silence, and for a moment it was as though time itself had paused. He looked down at his hands, seemingly lost in thought, before he glanced up, his gaze meeting mine with a quiet intensity that made my heart skip a beat. You wrote beautifully, he said softly, breaking the silence. It's like I can feel everything you were going through. I didn't know how to respond, feeling a warmth rise to my cheeks at his words. There was something genuine in his voice, an honesty that made me feel vulnerable, exposed, in a way I hadn't expected. I wanted to thank him, to tell him how much his words meant. But before I could speak, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. It was a small gesture, simple yet weighted, and I felt the air grow thick as our hands lingered, his touch warm against my skin. The room seemed to shrink around us, the walls pressing in, leaving just the two of us in that shared suspended moment. I pulled my hand back gently, a nervous smile flickering across my face as I tried to break the tension. Thank you for listening, I managed to say, my voice barely more than a whisper. I hadn't thought about those days in so long. He nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. It feels like you're a different person in those pages, but somehow still the same. His words struck a chord, echoing in a way that left me feeling both comforted and unsettled. It was as if he'd seen something in me that even I hadn't recognized. A part of myself I'd left behind without realizing it. I wanted to respond, to share something meaningful, but the words wouldn't come. After a moment, he stood up, brushing off his hands and looking out the window. It's strange, isn't it? All things change, but also stay the same. I nodded, following his gaze as it drifted over the landscape outside, the sunlight casting long shadows across the yard. Yes, I replied quietly, it really is. We left the room in silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts, the echoes of the past, lingering between us like whispers in the air. Back downstairs, I tried to busy myself, distracting my mind with small tasks, but I could still feel his presence, the weight of the unspoken hanging in the spaces between us. As the day wore on, the sun began to dip lower, casting a warm, golden light through the windows. I found myself glancing at him, catching glimpses of his profile as he read by the window or wandered through the house. Each time I felt that same strange pull, a connection I couldn't quite define. Something that went beyond words or simple family ties. Finally, as evening settled in, he joined me on the porch, sitting beside me in the fading light. We sat there quietly, watching as the sky turned shades of pink and purple, the silence comfortable, yet charged with everything left unspoken. It was as if we were waiting for something, an answer to a question neither of us had yet asked, and in that stillness I realized that the summer wasn't just changing him. It was changing me too. The quiet of the night settled over the lake house. The stars scattered across the sky like tiny fragments of light against the deep blue. I lay awake, unable to shake the lingering thoughts from the day, the words he'd said, the look in his eyes, and the way he'd listened so carefully to every passage I'd read from my old journal. Each memory was like a thread weaving its way through my mind, binding me to thoughts and emotions I'd long since buried. Unable to sleep, I wrapped myself in a sweater and headed out to the porch. The air was cool, with a gentle breeze rustling through the trees, and the world felt so still that even the softest sound seemed amplified. I stared out across the lake, the moon casting a shimmering reflection on its surface, trying to find some sense of peace. It was then I heard the creak of a floorboard behind me, and I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his silhouette outlined by the dim glow of the kitchen light. "I couldn't sleep either," he said quietly, stepping onto the porch beside me. We stood there for a moment, side by side in the stillness, watching the stars reflect on the water. There was a comfort in the silence, an ease that made it feel like we were the only two people in the world. Finally, he looked over at me. His expression softened, vulnerable in a way that caught me off guard. "I feel like there's so much I don't understand," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "about everything, like I'm supposed to have it all figured out. But I just don't." I nodded, his words echoing in my own heart. "I think everyone feels that way," I replied. "Even adults, we just learn to hide it better." He looked down, his hands resting on the porch railing. "It's like I don't know how to be who everyone expects me to be. There's so much pressure. So many things I don't feel ready for." His gaze shifted to the lake, his expression distant. "And here, it's different. It feels like I can actually think. Like maybe I don't have to have all the answers." I wanted to comfort him, to tell him that it was okay not to have everything figured out, but I found myself at a loss for words. It was rare to see him like this, so open, so honest. I reached out, placing a hand gently on his arm, a gesture that felt both natural and grounding, a small reassurance in the quiet of the night. He looked over at me, his eyes searching mine as though seeking something only I could give him. I held his gaze, feeling the weight of his thoughts, his questions, and his unspoken fears. In that moment, I wanted to tell him so many things, that he was not alone, that he didn't need to bear the world on his shoulders, that he was enough just as he was. But the words stayed locked inside, unable to bridge the gap between us. He reached out then, his hand brushing against mine. A simple touch that sent a shiver through me. I felt his fingers tighten, holding on as if afraid to let go. The world around us seemed to fade, the distant sounds of the forest, the whisper of the trees, all dissolving into the quietness of that shared moment. For a heartbeat, we stood frozen, neither of us willing to break the connection. But then, as if waking from a dream, I pulled my hand away, wrapping my arms around myself, the cool night air a sudden reminder of where we were. I took a deep breath, letting the silence settle once more. He stepped back, his gaze dropping to the ground, and I saw the flicker of something, unreadable in his expression, a hint of disappointment maybe, or perhaps confusion. I wanted to say something, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. Instead we stood there, the unspoken words hanging heavy between us, a fragile thread that neither of us knew how to untangle. After a long moment he cleared his throat, his voice barely a murmur. "Thanks for listening," he said, his tone hesitant, as though he were unsure if he'd said too much. "Of course," I replied, my voice soft. "You can talk to me any time. I'm here." He nodded, giving me a small, almost shy smile, and for the first time I saw a hint of relief in his eyes, as though my words had lifted some of the weight he'd been carrying. We stood in silence for a while longer, side by side, letting the night stretch on, the quietness of the world wrapping around us like a blanket. As the stars began to fade and the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, he finally turned, looking back at the house. "I guess I should try to sleep," he said, his voice thick with exhaustion. I nodded, feeling a strange ache in my chest as I watched him walk away, his figure disappearing into the shadows of the house. When he was gone, I stayed out on the porch, watching the sky lighten, the world slowly waking around me. I felt a strange bittersweet ache, a mix of emotions that I couldn't quite untangle. It was as if the night had revealed a side of him and of myself that I hadn't fully seen before, a quiet vulnerability that left me both comforted and deeply unsettled. There was something about that honesty, that openness, that had changed the air between us, leaving me with a feeling I couldn't quite name. As I finally made my way back inside, the silence of the house felt heavier, the quiet room seeming to hold the weight of everything left unsaid. And though the morning light cast everything in a soft glow, I couldn't shake the feeling that the night had marked a turning point, a moment that would linger, shaping the days to come in ways I was only beginning to understand. As the summer days dwindled, a quiet sadness settled over the house. Our time together was coming to an end, and though we rarely spoke of it, the awareness lingered in each shared glance, each small gesture. We spent those final days in a strange harmony, as if both of us were careful not to break the fragile peace we'd found. On his last evening, he joined me on the porch as the sun dipped below the lake, casting everything in hues of orange and gold. Neither of us spoke. Words seemed unnecessary, even intrusive. Instead, we sat side by side, letting the silence stretch between us, heavy with everything left unsaid. I wondered if he felt the same ache, the same bittersweet tangle of emotions. Finally, he turned to me, a soft, almost wistful expression on his face. "This place, it feels like it's part of me now," he murmured, his gaze drifting over the lake, the trees, the fading light. "I'll remember it, always." His words struck a chord, and I felt a pang of something deep and unnameable. I wanted to respond, to tell him he was welcome back whenever he needed to escape. But somehow I knew he already understood. We stood up, lingering at the edge of the porch, as if prolonging the moment. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out in a way that felt both familiar and new. I thought he might say something else, but instead he just looked at me, his eyes filled with a strange unspoken intensity. Before I could react, he pulled me into a hug, holding me in a way that felt final, yet filled with warmth and gratitude. I wrapped my arms around him, feeling the steady beat of his heart, and for a moment everything else faded away. There was only the quietness, the shared understanding, the silent goodbye. When he finally pulled back, he gave me one last lingering look. "Goodbye," he whispered, his voice soft but full of meaning, and then he turned and walked toward his car, disappearing down the winding path without a glance back. As I stood alone on the porch, a surprising sense of calm washed over me. I realized then that this summer, with all its unspoken moments and quiet discoveries, had left an indelible mark on both of us. And as I watched the stars appear one by one in the evening sky, I felt an unexpected comfort, as if a part of him still remained, woven into the stillness around me.